So we're very pleased today to have with us Professor James Walker.
It's great to be here.
of Indiana University, who spent a number of very productive years at ESL. So Jimmy, when was it that you were at ESL, to get the time frame right?
Okay, so I was a graduate student at Texas A&M and came to my first job out, assistant professor, fall of 1978, and came in. Let me back up a little bit, though, in terms of the experimental lab. I had come to the Westward Look, actually, and I think it was the spring of '77, with Ray Battaglio and another graduate student, to the meetings that were here that you couldn't get everybody in this room, but you got everybody was in one room. So it was probably 12 to 15 people.
And that's where we are now. We're at the Westward Look Resort.
So Vernon invited us down to see a new programming and a new experiment that Arlie Williams was developing, he and Arlie, on a computerized double auction. And I think Arlie calls it Plato double auction because that was the computer system that they were using and had not been using it very long.
And Arlie was a graduate student at the time?
Arlie was a graduate student at the time. And I think Arlie's now a colleague of mine at Indiana. I think Arlie said that we might have been, I think he was telling me that we were the probably the first ones outside of Vernon and the group here to actually be able to sit down and participate in this Plato double auction. So that was sort of my introduction to, computerized experiments, and actually in some ways lab experiments. So I was coming from Texas A&M working with John Cagle and Ray Battaglio, but at that point they were doing their animal experiments. They were doing some electricity demand experiments, because it was a period where energy conservation was a big issue at the time, thanks to the Arab oil embargo and those things. So I hadn't really come out of A&M with the experience of participating and conducting lab experiments. So that was the beginning, 1977. So luckily, I got a position here in '78. And to be honest, Vernon took me under his wing. And this was a time that he was starting to get interested in some types of auction experiments. So I got involved in a project with Vernon and Jim Cox, started developing software over at the lab, the Plato lab, which had moved, what Arlie called a large closet, had moved from the computer science building to the science library. But it was a pretty nice space. And so that was where the lab experiments were starting to be conducted at the U of A. I got involved and things went from there. So that was, it was a great opportunity. So ran auction experiments for a while. The time sort of flies. But what inevitably became really important is Vernon had an undergraduate student, Susan Thomas, who I think was writing probably an honors thesis. And he asked me to step in and if I could help sort of advise her. And that was partly developing software. And so that, we started working on that project. And again, I don't know the timing exactly, but Mark Isaac came here. And Mark had done public good experiments at Caltech. He had Isaac McHugh and Plot was the project he came in at. And it was just a natural sort of collaboration that started between Mark and I. And in fact, our first paper is Isaac Walker Thomas. Not many people, I think, know that paper, but Isaac Walker research from then on probably wouldn't have occurred without the Isaac Walker Thomas paper.
And so your research program on public goods was developed at U of A, at ESL?
It definitely was, yeah. Mark kind of came in this interest. I had got interested partly because of Vernon sort of connected me with Susan Thomas to advise her and help her. So it was a natural thing to happen. And yeah, as I've told people, it was, it's a collaboration that lasted 30 years. So, and I just talked to Mark a few weeks ago. It was great. It was, led us down a long path of looking at different types of public good settings.
Okay, so you were at ESL, if I understand correctly, from 1978 until 1984. Is that correct?
Right, to 1940, where I left for Indiana, where Arlie Williams was. Now, why is Arlie at Indiana? Because Indiana had the Plato computer system. So he was able to go there and sort of seamlessly begin to continue to run his experiments. So, and Arlie Arlie and I finished our dissertations about the same time, but he stayed on a year at a postdoc for working with Vernon. So we had a year that we became very good friends, working together, doing a lot of things together. So it was for me it was seamless then to go to Indiana and continue my research.
I see. So your colleagues at the time at ESL at Arizona, this was before the formal establishment of the ESL,
Right.
were Vernon Smith, Jim Cox, Mark Isaac, and Arlie Williams.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, within a couple of years of my coming here, Mark came here, Arlie was already here, Vernon and Jim were obviously already here. So yeah, I think that was the main group at least in those early years that were doing experiments. Right.
Can you give us a feel for how the technology for running experiments at that time, what it was like to run an experiment in 1978?
So I think so this computer system, Plato, had been developed at the University of Illinois, and we hadn't seen anything like it. This is a time where the computing we knew about were mainframes, right? Punch cards and these sorts of things. So in fact, I think I kind of remember when I sat down to participate in Arlie's his Plato double auction, I'm thinking, I have no idea what I'm doing. But it was incredible what these guys at Illinois had developed, because these were touch screens. They allowed this, they allowed the experimenter to design software, to take the decisions of the subjects, to record those decisions. But what was important is decisions of individuals could become common information. And that's what allowed things, in a sense, allowed you to have the experiment. That doesn't seem so much like a big deal today, but nothing existed like that at the time. And the Plato system at Arizona was connected to Illinois, connected to Indiana via phone lines. Later it became satellite, I think, and then later internet once it finally came along. So yeah, I mean, it was brand new for me. It quickly sort of, yeah, it was great. You get lucky sometimes, and you find out about this new approach to economic research. It fits. It was combining ideas with also like software development. How do you take what is somewhat of an abstract setting and create this decision-making setting that subjects who were, they were undergraduates to begin with at the U of A, or in Indiana, they are undergraduates at Indiana, and how do you create something that in some sense makes sense to them and they can participate either in these auction markets that I started off with originally, or later the public goods stuff, which I really stayed with. I mean, I think I haven't looked back to see how long the auction experiments, that collaboration went on. I'd say probably something like 10 years. But as I got more and more into the public goods literature and that path, it felt like a good path, a good fit for me.
So it sounds like your time at ESL, collaborating there with Mark Isaac, really influenced your later research a lot after you left.
Totally. There's no doubt about it. But again, I have to emphasize that wouldn't have happened without the support from Vernon. And it's also, even though it might not be formal, you're seeing other people running these experiments. And so you start to see, what does it mean to run an experiment? What does it mean to design an experiment? And obviously the conversations with Jim and Jim Cox and Vernon about developing an experimental design, how do you develop the software, not the software, but actually the instructions, et cetera, for what do we want to happen in these auction experiments. No, that's what created, in some sense, my research agenda for the rest of my life.
So maybe give us a feel for what those first few conferences were like. You said you were at the Tucson experimental workshops even before the formal establishment of ESA. So back in the 1970s, what was it like to be at an experimental economics conference then?
I think Arlie and I talk about it. I think we were in awe. I don't think I mentioned this earlier. The reason I came with Ray Battaglio is Ray did not fly. So it's a pretty long drive from College Station, Texas to Tucson. So Ray invited myself and another graduate student to come along. We shared driving, got to come out here. I remember getting to the westward look. I was like, wow, what a place. Vernon takes us all down to South Tucson for a Mexican dinner. Wonderful, you know. But the meetings themselves were, honestly, I can't remember the full group of people that were there, but it was probably 8 to 10 senior faculty, and that included Vernon and included John Cagle, Ray Battaglio, Charlie Plott, Roger Noel, and several others. And I think for Arlie and I, we were sitting in the background watching these guys, you know, and thinking, this is pretty good. But it was very much us keeping our mouths shut and listening and kind of growing from there. And, you know, to be honest, I don't remember this so much, but I'm guessing that, think about the trip from College Station to Tucson and back, and it's an opportunity for a lot of discussions. So it was great. It was great. You know, the next meetings after that 77, I'm not sure exactly when they are. What I remember about the early meetings were, as they grew a little bit, there were obviously multiple sessions. And it'd be interesting to see a program from back then, but in my mind, maybe 80% of them, 90% of them were market experiments. And it was this little one session maybe on public goods.
So
and
the composition of the field has really changed.
It's changed dramatically. And then Mark and I talked about this over time, at how it changed in future conferences leading up to the 85 True ESA conference, how much things had changed. Number of people, but what was being presented, the research that was being presented.
I mean, it sounds like you kind of helped launch kind of a big change when you began the research program in public goods.
By chance. So I think, you know, and the auction stuff was continuing. That's what John Cagle was talking about. So when I left A&M, John and Ray both, they took the next step as well, as moving toward running computerized experiments with humans, lab experiments. And so they had to get into this process of finding a way to develop the software for these interactive laboratory experiments. But we didn't have certainly the technology that you have today, right? You didn't have things like Z-Tree and other things. So it was pretty amazing. But their first steps, I'm pretty sure, but for both of them were, probably together to begin with, were auction experiments. So that was, or market experiments of some type, I should say more generally. And yeah, I don't know. You know, Jim Andrioni was running early experiments. I mean, obviously, so I probably didn't mention, I think, so Vernon had actually run, I'm pretty sure they must have been hand-run public good experiments before I got here. And I think that's what led Susan Thomas to be interested. And that's sort of my introduction to this. And how much they look like ours, I honestly don't know. But Mark and I were also influenced at the same time. There were researchers outside of economics, in sociology, social psychology, et cetera, that were also starting to look at environments, decision-making environments that had this public good aspect to them. And in particular, there was a paper by Marwell and Ames that had a big influence on, I think, on a lot of people. And my memory is, and I can still remember Mark and I talking about this, that we sort of took parts of the Marwell and Ames idea, and I would say we refined it to what became our basic decision-making setting, which is people call the voluntary contribution mechanism, VCM. And I think in a lot of ways we simplified it. And then maybe by simplifying it, it created an environment that maybe fit better with the economist way of thinking about these things, but also it made it more maybe tractable in some sense for others to take that environment and build on that environment. So yeah, but so Plato eventually became NovaNet. I think it became NovaNet after it was bought, the rights to use it by one of the publishing companies. I'm drawing a blank right now. And,
Let's see. I always wondered why the name changed.
and I think that could be it. It could be the technology they were using also to integrate the links between these computers. But I would say maybe it's been 10 years now that the NovaNet system finally went down, but we used it for a long time, and it's amazing how far ahead of times these guys were in terms of back at Illinois and developing this software. It was developed for educational purposes. The idea was students could be, this idea of this common information was that students would work independently on things. They would submit something and it would go to the common information, which was what the instructor would see. So that was the basic idea. So real lucky. And then obviously there's been this natural progression. It just occurred to me, another big change was, I was just telling somebody the other day, so we all now, if we're doing sort of standard, a lot of experiments have gone to online and things like that. But sort of the traditional experiment now is we use a database of subjects who have volunteered to be in experiments, and we use ORSI, most people do, to kind of manage that database. We were making phone calls, and they weren't on cell phones, so we were making real phone calls, and I don't know where we got...
Answering machines yet?
I don't know. That's a good question. I don't know. And I don't know where the list of subjects came from. I don't know if we went around, maybe we put up posters or something if you're interested. But we must have been getting, names, phone numbers, and you call people, and sometimes, you're up at night, sitting there calling people, trying to get enough people for an experiment.
So did you have it in this period, late 1970s, early 80s? I mean, experimental economics was very small and it was kind of a niche. Did you have some kind of inkling that it was going to be something big? That this was really the start of a major field, a major part of economics, or did you not really have that feeling?
Well, I know I had classmates that made the comments like, this stuff will be dead in 10 to 15 years. Obviously, they were wrong. So, I think it was a progression. And so you just see it happening, right? And so I don't know if I sort of explicitly thought about it, but you definitely just over time, I still think to this day, it was so game theory had been out there, obviously, but it was sort of this marriage of game theory and the idea of doing experiments together that really, I think, helped take experimental economics off, right? And if you think about it, there's also along this time, this idea of institutional analysis. So people starting to focus on institutions and how they can make a difference, whether it's in markets or public good settings or wherever. And so it's that marriage of these sort of approaches to thinking about economic decision making that I think really starts to help it be mainstream. You've also got some pretty influential people like Vernon and Charlie Plotnick and Battalion Kegel and others that I think they start to have, for one thing, I think they begin also there's this working with theorists. And so you start to see also the marriage between theory in general with experimental methods as well. So it wasn't, and I'm not sure it was really a slow progression. That's kind of an interesting question is how rapidly did all of this fit? Maybe you can tell by, if you could get some sense of how many people were coming to the meetings and how it grew over time. But now it's amazing, right? So the other thing that happened obviously was, I think early on we knew a little bit about experiments that were being conducted in Europe in particular. Way back then it was Reinhard Zelten. But that was the other thing that happened, and I'm not quite sure when this growth started, but you start to see a real growth in not only the US but in Europe, and then after that you start to see this really truly international growth, right? So, but it's kind of just this continuous process that occurs over time. I think having the support from NSF had to make a difference. And so that begins to happen, and
And the people you mentioned were the people to first get this support: Vernon, Charlie Plott, Kegel, Battaglio.
Exactly. Yeah. And Mark and I writing our first NSF proposals and getting funding was a big deal. And luckily for me, I go to Indiana, and I get to meet Lynn Ostrom, and Lynn has developed an interest. Lynn had far-reaching interests across methodologies, so she had an interest that kind of grew in doing experiments to look at common pool resource problems, which are sort of the cousin to public goods problems, social dilemma problems in general. So we started doing experiments on really building off of a model that a faculty member at Indiana had created, Scott Gordon. It goes back to the seminal article on this topic, I want to say 1954, JPE. So we kind of take that idea, it seems like a good starting point, and start running experiments, a lot of it being driven by game theory, and a lot of it being driven by institutional analysis. So again, then you see this branching out into other areas as well. And I think going back to the role of game theory, the broadening into different types of game theoretic decision-making environments had a big impact as well, right? So it all happens. But I couldn't have gotten luckier in terms of a place to go as my first being an assistant professor. I'm not sure. I think all of the lab at Arizona had gone from what Arlie calls this large closet to the science library building. And that's where I remember conducting experiments. There was a time, and again, I don't quite know the exact timing of this, the lab moved to the basement of the economics building. So there's that period in which it goes from the science library to the basement of the economics building to, I think, becoming the new lab in a sense. So I think we were still calling people on the phone.
Well, thanks for giving us really a flavor of what things were like back then.
It was great. It was great.
Yeah, let me ask you one last question. Can you think of some kind of interesting or unusual, funny episode that happened at ESL or at U of A at the econ department or somewhere there while you were there?
So what I've probably left out is more broadly, not even experimental. The department at economics, economics department at Arizona when I came here, was just a great place to be. There were quite a few new assistant professors, and so it wasn't just experimentalists, but getting to know people in general. And I think there was really a positive atmosphere in the department, at least that I could tell. And I've told people, it's almost Halloween, right? And I've told people about.
We're here in the fall. It's October 2021.
Yeah, and Halloween is Sunday, and so I still remember how it started. I don't know, but there was a Halloween party in the economics department, and somebody came up with the idea of asking people to dress up as economic concepts. And it was so funny. So one of the best ones was Mark Isaac. Mark Isaac came in with a kind of a sheet wrapped around him and a staff, so he was economic prophet, the prophet. And I tell people this one, I don't think so in mathematics, there's this idea of a bordered Hessian, right? Well, so I put on a serape, I put a helmet on my head, and I became an over-the-border Hessian. But maybe the best memory is somebody had brought in a big tub, filled it with water, put apples in it, and I can still see Vernon bobbing for apples. So it was, it was a great place to be. It was really a fun place to be. Being young helped as well, but and then obviously Tucson is a great environment to be in. So it was really nice.
Well, we think Tucson is still a great environment
I
to be
agree
in.
with that.
And I'd just like to thank you for talking with me. And
well, thanks for inviting me. I love reminiscing, thinking back to these days. I met my wife. Actually, I met my wife through the economics department because one of her sisters worked in the economics department. She introduced me, and so I have these other connections back that became extremely important in my life.
That's fantastic.
Yeah. So, but thanks, Charles. This has been great.
You're welcome.